The UN releases what it calls a somber report on the humanitarian crisis in Syria. Its incoming chief is in Moscow for talks, but can Antonio Guterres push Russia to end the conflict? And what role will the UN play in Syria under its new leader? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. When the UN's new Secretary-General assumes his duties in January, he will inherit, among other challenges, 6 years of war in Syria, a conflict that has many fronts, changing alliances and proxies. Antonio Guterres has said ending the conflict will be a top priority. He is in Russia at the moment to meet President Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They are the main allies of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and have been providing military support to his forces. But the world's top diplomat has a huge task ahead of him. Russia has used its veto in the UN Security Council against referring Syria to the International Criminal Court over allegations of war crimes. And the UN's failure to pass any meaningful resolution on Syria has dented confidence in the organization. The UN's humanitarian advisor has given an update on the situation in Syria.
We just finished the meeting of the humanitarian task force. It was another very somber report by our field personnel in Syria and outside from Turkey. We only could do one convoy so far in November. We do now have written approval and principle by the armed opposition groups of East Aleppo. We have verbal support also from the Russian Federation on our four-point plan. We need written support, and we need unconditional support also from Russia, and we are waiting still for the answer from the government of Syria.
Rory Challens has more on the meeting between Antonio Guterres and Russian leaders in Moscow.
In coming to Moscow to speak with the Russians, Antonio Guterres is diving headfirst into what he's called the top priority of his new job, ending the war in Syria. He will know, though, how difficult this is going to be. It's eluded the world for the last 5 years, and he'll be fully aware of the limitations of the role of UN Secretary-General. It's not entirely powerless, though. He can, of course, act as a voice of moral authority, speaking out against injustice. He can facilitate and steer diplomacy, and the UN has a vital role to play in providing humanitarian relief for the beleaguered population of Syria. The strongest cards in this conflict, though, are held by the war's key power brokers, the United States and Russia, and Guterres has urged these two countries to make peace with each other. And Guterres, as well as everybody else, will be watching what happens next in Washington, D.C., and which course of action the US President-elect Donald Trump chooses for Syria. Rory Challens for Inside Story in Moscow.
Guterres is not the only new face at the UN. US President-elect Donald Trump has just nominated Nikki Haley as ambassador to the UN. The governor of South Carolina has fought against settling Syrian refugees in her state. It's not clear yet what, if any, foreign affairs experience she has. Her predecessor, Samantha Power, has made little or no progress in her negotiations with Russia. So will the new arrivals at the UN bring a shift in tactic for the war in Syria? So let's bring in our guests in Moscow. Vyacheslav Matuzov, a former diplomat and now chairman of the Russian Friendship Society with Arab countries. In Washington, D.C., Hilary Mann Leverett, a political analyst and former White House national Security official and here in Doha, Marwan Kabalan, a Syrian academic and writer and an analyst with the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies at the Doha Institute. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Marwan Kabalan, Guterres says, and I'm sure this is a relief for many, that Syria will be a top priority for the UN. What can he do?
I'm sure it will. I think Antonio Guterres, we all know that he is not a stranger to the Syrian crisis. He has been closely involved in providing humanitarian access to most of the cities which had been under siege by the Syrian regime for the past few years. And I think it's a good development actually to have him actually on leading the United Nations over the next 5 years. We are very optimistic that the man will save no efforts in order to bring peace and stability to Syria, and also to provide the sort of humanitarian access that he has been trying actually to provide for those people.
So do you think humanitarian access will be the focal point now of the UN? Will that be the shift that he makes?
Well, I think because there seems to be no enough actually incentives and factors for any political progress concerning the political settlement and political solution in Syria. So I think Mr. Guterres at this point of time actually will be focusing mainly on trying to save as many lives as possible, especially in Aleppo. We all see in fact what's happening right now in Aleppo, given the aerial bombardment by both Russian air forces and the Syrian regime of forces in Aleppo. We know that in Aleppo there are at least 250,000 civilians are trapped in the city. And they are trapped actually in the middle of this crossfire between the Syrian opposition and the Syrian regime. So I think Mr. Guterres will be doing his best, in my opinion, will be using his moral authority as a UN Secretary General in order to provide what his predecessor, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, couldn't do over the past few months.
Vyacheslav Guterres, he's in Moscow today, Thursday. We've got no pictures of him because the meetings are happening behind closed doors. But what's the discussion there, and what is the view from Russia on him taking over this top job?
Well, I think that the situation in the world is changing. It's changing dramatically, and it is absolutely different than international relations we watched previous decade, for example. Because we have changes in American administration. We have changes in Europe leadership, France, Germany, and also the principal changes in United Nations organization. Because there are quite a lot of misunderstanding between Russia and Ban Ki-moon, for example. Russia was watching him as a person, very important, but he was oriented to the American position more than to the United Nations. And it is obvious that he is nominated as a candidate for presidency in South Korea, and he needed support from different international forces, first of all from the United States.
So you say he really took his eye off the issue at hand here?
Well, I think that all changes in the world policy today opened a new era of understanding, of misunderstanding. My opinion is that understanding will be much more this year between Russia, United States, Europe, and United Nations. On the base of understanding, mutual understanding, I think that solution of Syrian crisis, Ukrainian crisis, and many other hot issues like in Yemen, in Libya, will be solved more peacefully, more mentally, more argumentally. I think that it is a good chance for all of us to work to achieve all these goals. Syria, of course, will be on the top of our issues that needed to be solved.
Well, wouldn't that be wonderful if all that were to come true? Hilary Mann-Leverett, when it comes to Guterres, can he only be better off as far as Syria is concerned in his position at the UN? I mean, what do we know about him that he will make the changes that are so desperately needed and that Ban Ki-moon wasn't able to?
Well, we do know a lot about him. Interestingly, he has a long and really celebrated career at the United Nations, someone that was supported by all key players at the United Nations, including Russia and the United States. This is one of the few areas we came together to support his nomination and his election as Secretary General. In particular, he has 10 years of experience with refugees, with the UN agency dealing with refugees. He has a particular understanding and knowledge of how the UN works intellectually, ideologically, and practically on issues related to refugees, and in particular, how to demobilize, disarm, and hopefully reintegrate militants who will hopefully become former militants back into their society. And in the Syrian case, that's either in Syria or in their home countries from which they've come. This is a critically important component because the war, in my view, is going to shift with this dramatic change in U.S. policy toward one where there's more support for Russia and the Syrian government to use the military to consolidate the Syrian government's authority in Syria. And the political component, I think, will shift more to, we might say, I don't want to say pro-Russian, but certainly not the pro-Western Syrian oppositionists to
and that's
have a political process.
Where Trump steps in here, including his new ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. I mean, what do we know about her? Some have said that, you know, at least she's not an angry white man, but she doesn't have any foreign policy experience, and she's not really a fan of Syrian refugees either.
Well, I think the most important thing to know about her is that she's a deal maker. She's a deal maker from a very tough environment. She's someone from an immigrant Indian family in the United States, in South Carolina, where immigrants of whatever their origin have not always been all that welcome. And she made her way in the political process in the rough and tumble of South Carolina to become governor of that state, the youngest governor, the first female governor, and the first governor of an immigrant background. So she's a real deal maker from the rough and tumble of the heartland of the United States. And that's going to be a very different character, a very different personality than our current ambassador, Samantha Power, who was not there really to make deals. She was there to be the so-called moral voice of the United States, regardless of who she got into a fight with. And that was often with her Russian counterpart. So we will have a very different approach both here in Washington from the president himself and from the new U.S. ambassador, Nikki Haley, to the United Nations. A real deal maker,
how do you
not
feel?
So much someone standing on their moral chair.
Okay. How do you feel as a Syrian, and what you know about the country now diplomatically, looking at that shift in U.S. position as highlighted by Hillary, and possibly the U.S. moving closer to Russia, Russia not being so demonized as it has been by the U.S. allies?
Well, I think that is not going to be a big surprise anyway, because we all know that the incoming administration will not actually be seeing the Syrian opposition in a more sympathetic way, the way perhaps the Obama administration was viewing it. And we know that President Trump will be more concerned perhaps, or as much concerned with the fighting the Islamic State as President Obama was, but he's going to be less sympathetic with the Syrian opposition. I think the Syrian opposition is very concerned about that. One must admit that. But at the end of the day, there is no way that a political solution in Syria can be achieved without actually having the Syrian regime right now moving towards a middle ground, because people in the country and outside the country, don't forget now, we have like 8 million people who are displaced inside Syria. We have 4 or 5 million who are refugees outside Syria today. So half of the Syrian people are either made displaced inside Syria or are refugees outside the country. Most of the country is destroyed or have been destroyed over the past 6 years of this war. In my opinion, it's becoming meaningless war. So there is going to be no political solution unless we have a middle ground. Bashar al-Assad cannot stay there after all this killing and carnage. I mean, President Putin will not be able to impose his will at the end of the day if we are going to have peace and security and stability in this part of the world. Because I mean, you can perhaps defeat the Syrian opposition for a short period of time, but that they are going to turn into a guerrilla war very time soon, I think, and that's going to put Syria in a very difficult situation, and is going to be putting almost everybody, the whole region, in a very difficult situation in which we are going to have this war of attrition against the regime, against the Russians, against the Iranians, and at the end of the day, we are not going to have peace and security, as I said, unless we have this middle ground, a political situation in which everybody is happy.
Let's talk about that middle ground with Vyacheslav. I mean, is that going to happen? Marwan was saying that Assad will need to move on, but does he need to move on? If the US is going to align itself closer with Russia, then Assad's in a pretty comfortable position. Why should he go?
Well, I think it is not the situation of Russian position or any other position, because regarding is American position. I think that changing in the United Nations representation of the United States, it's a very important step, because as we watched Samantha Power during her stay in the United Nations, she was a good fighter. She was not trying to make bridges between countries of constant members of the Security Council. She was fighting Turkey all that time. But I hope that new post that was to Mrs. Haley will help to walk out of this circle. Because, as I heard, is it true or not, should be approved, that Mrs. Haley was higher ranking in the United States administration, giving her a rank of minister. Is this ministerial status of American representative in the United Nations give more power to more weight to the voice of your United States representative in the United Nations? I think that it will be very good for developing relations. I don't say that they will refuse or support or not support Bashar Assad, because the main issue is to find a logical and minded position, minded solution or any crisis.
Okay.
Because
all right, so
you raise
many points, and just forgive me for jumping in here. So, you know, shifting political allegiances has been raised, the growing humanitarian situation, and of course, so many different players on the ground. Let's take a look now at what's going on with Osama bin Javed. He's got the latest from Gaziantep.
There have been a number of diplomatic developments that we've seen about Syria in the last few days. We heard an impassioned appeal from the UN humanitarian chief about the situation in Aleppo, where we said that we should all be ashamed of what is happening inside Aleppo, and we are not able to save these lives. Nearly 300,000 people remain stranded in the city, and you speak to people inside the city of Aleppo, they say that they know for certain that they will die, they just don't know how they will die. They can't leave their homes because they are being bombarded, and they can't go anywhere else because all of the important infrastructure in the city, including roads, hospitals, and other parts, have been taken out by this intense campaign of bombardment. The UN has been warning that there is very, very little food that is left inside the city. All of the operating hospitals have been taken out by bombardment, and rescuers have also been targeted in the last few days of this intense aerial campaign. Just yesterday, we heard from activists and doctors appealing for airdrops. They want the international community, including the United States, to drop some aid into the besieged city of Aleppo, which has remained under siege for months now. The last time aid was allowed in was in the month of August, when rebels broke the siege. Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story in Gaziantep.
And of course, it's almost impossible to get an accurate figure of the number of people killed. The UN has stopped counting, but we do know that hundreds of thousands of people have been killed since the war began. Around 11 million Syrians have been displaced, with 4.8 million of those fleeing to neighbouring countries. The number of people living in besieged areas has nearly doubled in the past 6 months to around 1 million people. The worst hit area is the opposition-held eastern Aleppo, where 250,000 people are trapped. What's happening in Aleppo, Hillary, is symbolic or symptomatic of what's happening in the rest of the country. It seems that the opposition is being totally destroyed. One country's terrorist is another country's ally. How are those players going to be put into place now so that that unacceptable humanitarian situation is stopped?
I don't have a lot of good answers for you. I don't think there are going to be a lot of good answers coming from the United States. My understanding of the incoming president, President-elect Trump, is to proceed very much full force with the military campaign led by Russia and the Syrian government to eject any militants that are not aligned with the Syrian government from Syrian territory. And this is where it's going to be so critically important that the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, step in with not just a plan to give food to refugees, but a real comprehensive plan for demobilizing, disarming, and reintegrating Syrians into their own society. That is going to be a tremendous amount of work, and it's going to fall largely on Guterres' shoulders at the United Nations. From the U.S. perspective, from the incoming Trump administration's perspective here in Washington, it's going to be to look to work with Assad wherever it can, to look at other so-called strong leaders on the international scene, whether that's Putin in Russia or Sisi in Egypt. That's going to be the approach of this administration. It's not going to be one that focuses on humanitarian concerns, however grave they are in countries like Syria. That's not going to be a priority, in my view, for the incoming Trump administration.
Well, if that is not a priority, Marwan, I mean, clearly that's worrying, and it makes you wonder how many people have to die for this war to end. I mean, what will you need to hear and see as a Syrian in order for you to go back and trust?
That is very alarming indeed for any Syrian actually who's either living inside the country or outside the country. When we have like the kind of this U.S. administration which doesn't really care about violations of human rights or the killing of civilians in besieged area, or when we have an administration like Mr. Vladimir Putin administration who's willing actually to fight the West until the last drop of Syrian blood. I mean, because Mr. Matazov, he mentioned earlier Ukraine, and this is where I think Mr. Putin is really, the area where Mr. Putin is really interested in order to have this trade between Syria and Ukraine. So the point that I'm trying to make here, if we are having these sort of administrations in both Moscow and Washington, I must admit that there is not much actually room for optimism here, because the situation on the ground maybe is going to become much worse before we can see any sort of improvement. But any sort of improvement, in my opinion, will be very, very limited and for a very short period of time. Because as I told you, I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of Syrians who lost their loved ones, who lost families, who lost something dear to them. So I think those people are willing to fight until also the last drop of their own blood. I mean, this is where actually we are not gonna solve the situation by this. We are going to have more people actually sympathizing with the Islamic State. We are going to have more people sympathizing with Islamic extremists and jihadists, not only in Syria but throughout the region. This is something
So hold on, that turns Vyacheslav's argument on its head, the fact that the situation, if anything, is going to get a lot worse, particularly with Russian intervention, the fact that Russia seems to be okay bombing hospitals along with its Syrian allies.
Well, Russia is feeling well. Why? Because the idea of political solution of Syrian crisis is on the table of new American administration, in my opinion, because Russia persistently insisted on the term that there is no alternative to peaceful solution of Syrian crisis, and rejected military solution fully. What side rejected stop fire and all these agreements that were registered by Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry? They don't inclined to fulfill all these agreements. They refused to support these agreements even. So I think that in new situation, it should be more open door for political solution, for establishing Geneva Conference. What Stefano de Mistura failed to do is to accelerate, to push ahead the negotiational process. So
Okay.
I think that this stage will be overcome, and instead of fighting in Aleppo, in Idlib, in Raqqa, we shall come and to Geneva, have Syrian, both sides, opposition and governmental side will solve all this issue.
All right,
with
let's leave it
support
there.
of joint
Vyacheslav
efforts,
Matuzov.
American, Russian, European.
Thank you very much for those final words. Hilary Mann, Leverett and Marwan Kabalan. Thank you, all three of you. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, please go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, mine @Jane Dutton. And for me, Jane, and the rest of the team, goodbye for now.